Hey everybody, let's talk about designing a sandbox game. If you're designing a sandbox game, you can't take a linear design and then file off the linear parts. That's not going to work. You have to design it as a sandbox game right from the start because the player engages with a sandbox game in a very different way. So, let's talk about a way of thinking about things. A way of thinking about things that will help you to leverage the difference between a sandbox game and a linear game. I call it a sandbox elements, and it's based on the elements of circumstances. If you're not familiar with the elements of circumstances, it's just a fancy way to talk about the 5 W's or the 6 W's. That would be these guys. Boom. So let's talk about it. Why is it different between a linear game and a sandbox game? Well, in a linear game, the player asks these questions and the game answers. That's how the game builds its narrative. You're going here next. You're doing this thing now. You're going to be doing that thing next. You're getting these missile launchers to use in these situations, and that matters in this story for these reasons. But in a sandbox game, it's the opposite. In a sandbox game, the game asks, and the player answers. And you have to build your entire game so that the player wants to answer these questions. If you ask the player, "Where are you going?" you shouldn't get an answer. You should get an unending fizz of answers. The player should be so inspired by your setting that they're like, I want to go there, and there, and there, and there, ooh, and over there too. And if you say, what are you going to be doing? The player should say, oh, I want to be out doing this and this, or this. How about this? Who are you there for? This guy, and this guy, and this guy, and this guy. You want the player to answer as many of these questions as possible with a vibrant fizz, because these all interlock. We're not trying to build a story in our sandbox game, but we are trying to build a circumstance. We want these answers to interlock so that the player will want to try a million different interlocking answers. We want the player to create a million different circumstances. That's what gives sandbox games their vibrancy. An easy example of this is Hitman again. Hitman literally answers these questions with randomized cards that pop up in challenge mode. And of course, players frequently come up with these answers on their own as well, just because they think they're cool. If you go into a mission in Hitman and they'll say, you need to murder this person with this weapon while dressed as this person at this place or at this specific time. And it's like, oh, okay, that's a circumstance that is provided for by the game. The game levels have been built to allow those questions to be answered in that way. And the player will often come up with those kinds of things on their own. Like, I'm going to do a mission dressed entirely as a fish salesman, because I think that would be cool. And the way that the game interlocks means that being dressed as a fish salesman changes all of these other answers, changes how these answers work together. It's the same with Kerbal. If you go into Kerbal, where are you going? Well, every single planet on the map is interesting in its own way. It's positioned in a specific place. It has different gravity. It means something different. Its difficulties are different, and all that stuff varies, and you get a really meaty sensation. And what are you going to do there? Well, you could build a colony or drop off a rover or any of a million other things. The ability for us to create these circumstances allows us to chain them together in ways that are very, very compelling to us personally, but only if we fizz with answers, only if we want to go to these places, do these things. The good news is the game doesn't have to do it on its own. The players bring a lot of this stuff in from outside. When the player comes over to your game, they're going to be thinking about a million things that are similar to your game. If you go into Minecraft and you say, well, what are you going to build in Minecraft? The player's probably going to say, I want to build a castle or a mansion. Because they come in from the outside where castles and mansions are interesting things to have. Minecraft itself doesn't have really the concept of a castle or a mansion. Those things don't exist in the game world. But the player brings them in from outside and the game supports them. So when the player thinks about, what am I going to build? They can literally think of anything that they've ever seen in reality, in another game, in a story somewhere, and they can say, let's try and build that. And even if the game doesn't completely support that kind of construction, as long as they can ask some of the other questions and answer those, they can sort of lock it together. Like, I want to build a giant castle in the sky. for my friend Doug out of cheese, whatever, right? The whole point here is that because these answers interlock, and because the player brings so many of these answers from the outside, you can get an almost unending combination of elements that combine into really unique circumstances per player. Your job as the designer is to make sure that your setting supports an endless fizz of answers, both brought in from outside, inspired from outside, and coming out of the game itself. And if you're in Kerbal, the little red planet is interesting within Kerbal on its own, but it also resonates with the idea of Mars that's being brought in from outside. If you're playing Hitman, the idea of, a karate-only run, a hand combat-only run, it has meaning both in the game, because you're going to be doing a specific kind of action that has specific kinds of circumstances, and from the outside, because you've seen, a whole bunch of movies where an unarmed combatant goes up against an endless horde of enemies and has to use their cunning. It resonates with both. And then you would add the additional questions in. You're doing that? Okay. When? Where? With who? And suddenly, there are a million possibilities. Because all of these answers interlock in complicated and interesting ways. And that's why you have to take such care when you're designing your game world. You really want the player to fizz with answers, and if your game world just doesn't help to do that, then it's not going to be a very fun sandbox. Anyway, that's what I think about it. Let me know what you think. Have a good one.